Okay, so good evening and hi everyone. We are here again on this program of Narrative Malaysia's podcast and also video. This series is a podcast series where we discuss and we speak to notable scholars or experienced scholars within the fields of social sciences and also interdisciplinary studies in Malaysia and also abroad. So with us today, we are very glad and we are grateful to have with us Dr. Diana Wong, who is presently Dean of the Graduate School in New Era College right now. She's studied in universities in Germany and also in Singapore in sociology and also development studies, if I can just expand it a bit. And then also she has worked extensively in many places from Germany to the US, in Singapore and also in Malaysia. And right now she's back and based in New Era College. So thank you very much, Dr. Diana Wong, for being with us today. So maybe if we could just have a casual conversation, and then maybe I'd just like to ask you, in looking at recent events in Malaysia right now, a lot of very critical and big issues. Maybe you could perhaps share with us or help us try to make sense of what's happening now and what perhaps are the core issues or incidents or moments that we should try to understand and focus on.
Right, that's a big question.
Yeah.
And maybe your generation can speak more to that.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that you are in your 30s
Okay.
or late 20s.
Yeah.
The future is yours. My generation is a much older generation, and maybe not even the most important generation in terms of what is happening, what has happened, what this country stands for, what it could be, and what, it should be. We think of the founder generation. That goes back a long way, but of course, one fundamental event was Second World War, and then the ensuing end of empire, and the fight for independence. That generation had their dreams, their visions of what it meant to have a Malaysian nation. And I think from the very beginning, and that is something that I think would help us to understand what has just happened in this country and what is so important for this country, there were different notions of nation. Yeah. I think that is very, very important to understand and to accept that there were conflicting and different notions of the nation, of what the nation should be. And I think that was one of the main problems that my generation perhaps failed to understand, and maybe succeeding generations also fail to understand and to appreciate, that there are these questions of nation of intent. There are different nations. There were, from the very beginning, different nations of intent.
Yeah.
And I think we understand too little about it.
Yeah. But in your opinion, Dr. Diana, what do you think? Is it the same as before, or have these questions become more, if I may use the word, polarizing, or has it become more intense in the way we try to grapple with and understand these questions as compared to in previous moments?
Well, there have been shifts in the basis of power of the different notions or nations or imaginations of the nation. That is something that we have to keep an eye on as well, especially as social scientists. It's not just the imaginary, because the imaginary is important, but there are shifts in the relations of power.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
A lot of this is has to do with sources of power embedded in language.
Language.
I think so little is understood of alternative or conflicting or different visions of the nation, because they are very often in our country expressed in different languages.
Languages.
Right.
By languages, you mean
Malay, Chinese, English,
okay.
Tamil.
The Tamil. Okay, the diversity of spoken languages.
Diversity of linguistic groups in this
in the
country.
country.
And the dominance of the English educated.
Yeah.
Very simply put.
Okay.
And I think that has been part of the problem of social sciences as well. The social sciences has been expressed in Anglo-Saxon language. It's the language of the university.
Right.
Of course, it's been replaced to some extent by Malay.
Yeah.
And that has become a more important language of expression.
That's right. Yeah.
For also imaginations of the nation. But there is also a vibrant Chinese language community, speech community.
I suppose many people they are not familiar and engaged.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I think this has been a dilemma that we just have not been able to overcome.
Yeah. Well, so now, since that you mentioned in the social sciences or social scientists, so in your opinion, do you think existing or maybe previous social science approaches are adequate, or do we need to explore more different approaches to try to navigate and understand, and even maybe, as you put it, to even just to connect them together to have a more meaningful conversation, would you say? So are there any, or have there been any?
I think when you first started, I don't know whether you mentioned it in your introduction, but you were talking about as far as social science is concerned, the need to reflect on theory, on praxis, on what we do. I think quite apart from theory, we have to think maybe of a problem of social sciences in Malaysia, I think, is a question of methodology also, or the issue of methodology.
Okay.
It seems to me that there's a difference between, probably one major difference between my generation of social scientists, and I'm talking about the generation that was trained in the 1970s. And maybe the succeeding generations, as I said, there was a vacuum really of social scientists. And then maybe about 10, 20 years ago, we were thrilled to see a new generation coming, emerging, but maybe trained a bit differently, more theoretically informed. More theoretically informed than my generation. Because probably you were trained, of course it was a different era, but you were trained in more sophisticated departments abroad. But my generation, I think we were trained in perhaps a neo-Marxist tradition at that time in the 70s, but it was a different political international configuration at that time. It was still the Cold War.
Yeah, the background of
it was still the Cold War, and there were still issues of poverty. So my generation actually went into the field, so to speak. I mean, I decided to do my PhD on the Green Revolution in a Malay village in Kedah. I actually spent a year in a village in Kedah. When I came back to the country in 98, I tried to catch up on the work which had been done in the meantime on the peasantry or on the rural countryside in Malaysia.
And you?
Nothing. Virtually nothing. And I think that is one of the major problems for us now as social scientists, wanting to comment or thinking of commenting in a more profound manner, a more analytical manner on recent events in Malaysia, let's say.
Yeah.
We don't have the empirical base
Okay.
to really be able to analyze in a more profound way what are the social forces behind shifts in the imaginary, but as well as shifts in the power basis,
Yeah.
the social basis, the social forces which underlie changes. Of course, there would have been changes from the dilemmas of the 1940s
Yeah.
to the 2020s, but there definitely will have been shifts. We recognize an enduring pattern, but what are the shifts?
Okay.
And why has the pattern endured? I'm afraid we need social science research, empirical research, rather than just pronouncements by public intellectuals, as to in order to understand.
Okay. So
I mean that, and I think that's there. The question of methodology is very
methodology
important.
comes to the
Yeah, theory, of course. But you see, unfortunately, just as my generation looked for modes of production
within the paradigm of the
in every little village or in every little town,
yeah.
or every historical epoch, theoretical paradigms which are developed based on postmodern, post-industrial societies
Yeah.
are important, are useful, but they may not bring us very far too in understanding, and they may also divert our attention away from the field, from the empirical social research which has to be undertaken. I think, for example, of what is happening in the countryside. I think, for example, of what do we know about the Malay working class in the Klang Valley?
Yeah.
What do we know of the Chinese working class, which has, in a way, bifurcated, I think, but largely entered into the ranks of the lower middle class, living in the hundreds of tamans in the Klang Valley.
Yeah.
No longer squatters. I mean, they constituted the majority of the squatters in the 1950s and 60s, both in the countryside as well as in the urban centers. You don't see them anymore. What's happened to them? How do they think? What about the Indian plantation labor force that is no longer part of the Indian plantation labor force? We think we think of we hear things like, nowadays no more Chinese gangs, all Indian gangs already.
That's what people say.
That's what people say.
Yeah.
But do we have a solid studies of how people survive? How do these young men earn their livelihoods today? And what is their cultural their cultural universe? What is the cultural universe to which they belong, as against the cultural universe to which Malay working class in Gombak, for example, belong? Or the Chinese lower middle class, say in Kapong, just around the corner.
Right. So those are all very glaring gaps within our understanding of how it's just not there. And then
I don't know. Would you know of any studies? Would the younger generation be more au courant about?
They may. I suppose they may exist, but not maybe in a systematic or in a conscious way of trying to unearth all this existing. Would you say? Questions on the ground. That could be.
Forces, changing social forces on the ground. And that's what we're just talking about the lower class.
It's just one layer. It's just one area.
The super rich. What do we know about the super rich? And how they are linked into the globalized elite. Transcontinental.
Those are very. So, Dr. Ned, speaking of this research and work, so maybe we could go back a bit, and maybe if I can ask you, so in your experience till now, in your work, how do you see yourself, and what kind of research has interested you, or have always been something that you've reflected on and on again. And how have you seen this research and work throughout different places you've been to and also tried to study?
I think for my generation, the imperative was how to cross bridges, how to cross barriers.
Yeah.
And that's why I did my PhD on the Malay village.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the academics in my time would have been urban creatures. Penang, born and based, Singapore, born and based, KL, born and based, mostly Penang, born and based. They were the best social scientists. So we had a lot to learn. It was a time when being growing up in the city was still not so typical.
Okay.
So yeah, I think we had a lot to learn about the country.
And so you moved into, I think you mentioned the Green Revolution. So you started off by studying the peasantry in the Malay village in Kedah, and then if then you and I think you studied you've written on gender as well, ethnic relations.
Not so much.
Yeah, ethnic relations and gender. Have this been constant with your?
I think my first interest was in the countryside.
The countryside.
And that was because I was Singapore born and bred. Well, not born, but bred.
Yeah.
Then I did work then I was in Germany. So there I did work. Somebody told me, I remember speaking to a senior academic then, and I wasn't quite sure what to do next as a research topic. And she said to me, think about where the most marginalized people are. I was in Germany then. So I decided to do my next research project on refugees
Right. Okay.
in Europe.
In Europe.
At a time when being a refugee was still very much, when the refugees were still very much a problematic category. And then I came back to Singapore.
Yeah.
And I did work on... That was when my work on migration started. On refugees in Germany. And it was an eye-opener to me, because working on the peasantry, you think of people in place. You think of being sedentary. You think of having, being bound to the soil. Whereas when you work on migration, then I began to see everything was in flux. People were moving about all the time.
Everywhere, and you can't...
Everywhere, yeah. That was what the world was about. Not just being in, having your place in the world, but not having a place in the world.
I can imagine. So even the research structure and the method becomes even more fluid and...
Yeah, I suppose what it shows is that for many of us in the social sciences, what we do is really driven by our own need to understand, by our need to understand ourselves. That's part of the problem, part of the challenge of the social sciences.
Yeah.
I think one reason why we do social science, it's not always a good thing. It can be very self-indulgent.
Yeah.
But yeah. So then at the moment, so I did some work on
migration and
migrants and
refugees
and in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, it's not so much refugees but labor migrants.
Labor migration.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I did some work on labor migrants. At the moment, the current research I'm doing on something quite different. Although related, there is a certain logic, and that is I'm doing local history of Kapong.
Oh, local, yeah.
Yeah, Kapong used to be a tin mine.
Yap
Alloy had a couple of mines there.
Yeah.
And so it was a classical tin and rubber economy kind of settlement.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to look at there is a longue durée history of a Malaysian settlement.
Mm-hmm.
It started maybe in 1874, and we can follow it up to maybe 2004, over 100 years.
Yeah.
As much as possible, because there's not much material available. But a long durée local history
Okay.
of a migrant community that settles down. So, migration, when we think of migration, we think always of the move, people on the move.
Yeah.
But people actually also settle down.
And that's a very strong characteristic, I think, of Malaysian.
And that's very much a part of Malaysian history.
Yeah.
How we began, many of us, almost all of us, began as migrants
Yeah.
and settled down.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So in this, so you've done a broad range of from, if I may say, from starting off with research in the village, development, or I suppose peasant studies, to refugees, to migration, to history. So in what drives you to, or what helps you to draw links, or is there any link at all? If we can say, how do you reconcile these different? Are there any connecting or linking themes, or as you said, it's a search for meaning that binds all these different things together, and so many different places.
Personally, it's a search for meaning.
Yeah,
obviously.
And I'm sure maybe for many of us, I see. Yeah, I maybe for many people and myself too. I'm quite sure. Yeah.
Right. I think methodologically, I think there is a theme running through what I have done. I begin to recognize it now. I don't think I would have recognized it earlier. But a theme running through the work I did as a rookie social scientist in the village in Kedah to what I do today is the perspective from below.
I see.
Through the lens of the household, of the individual, not just of the individual, but the individual in his family. Through the telling of, well, in peasant studies, it was, the key concept was a household economy. And it was, I suppose, part of that generation. We were taught we actually had to go to a village and stay there, and talk to people.
It reminds of the socialist movement, engaging the masses.
Engaging the masses, but, well, when you can engage the masses. It's not so easy to engage the masses. It was terribly difficult for me to learn how to talk to villagers.
Yeah.
I grew up in Singapore. I was so shy. I was so afraid of doing things wrong.
Yeah.
It meant having to go out of your comfort zone, forcing yourself to face the challenge of overcoming your own insecurities, your own fears, and your own fear of rejection. I was very afraid of being rejected. I thought, my God, these people are so nice, and I'm this horrible person from the city. No manners, nothing. That is a constant fear in doing social science research on the ground.
Yeah.
But having gone through doing that in Malaysia, in a way as a foreigner, doing refugee research in Germany, I did 3 communities: Iranians, Ethiopians, and Afghans.
Afghanistan. Okay.
Again, as in a way a stranger, a foreigner.
Yeah.
But that was good because we were both
We're
foreigners.
foreigners.
And now doing research in Kapong, like a foreigner, I don't speak Chinese. I have to learn to speak Chinese. My Chinese is still horrible.
The language again.
A language again. At
yeah.
each step of the way, it's been the language.
Yeah.
But at each step of the way, I've realized, especially as I have matured as an academic, and as I learn to read academic texts, theoretical texts as well, but other academic texts from a perspective that I have now acquired through my own research,
Mm-hmm.
I realized that this speaking to people, doing research from the bottom up,
From below, from
and looking at them, seeing the macro context from that view from below. It makes a hell of a lot of difference, both theoretically as well, in terms of the theoretical outcomes. You see, it's not just, it's history now. You look at the way history has been written of Malaysia.
Yeah.
Economic history has been divided essentially into sectors. We have the history of rubber, history of tin,
Yeah.
a history of the rice cultivators.
Yeah.
That's the way economic history has been written.
Yeah.
Then now we have the corporate sector, now history of corporate sector. But they're all macro data, macro level data, and they are written with the help of documentation, very often company records, or archival materials,
Colonial.
which are colonial authority records
Yeah.
of how the people below have been governed. You look at the literature on the New Village,
Yeah.
completely based on archive on government documents.
Yeah. That itself is a challenge as well, I think, because then your research conforms to a certain structure that has already been there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so even so if you do a history, as you said, it's a thin mind history, because it perpetuates historical colonial structures, and so there's a need, I suppose, also to break this. So so I suppose this is where innovation or even cross-disciplinary projects come in to try to connect dots that were previously not there, and maybe I find it very interesting that doing research in so many places also requires not only an interdisciplinary but also a comparative perspective that transcends countries, borders, societies, and even borders are, we could say, an artificial concept, right? Has that benefited you, or how have they informed your research? Is it a very pronounced?
I think the comparative angle has been very important for the way I look at things. It's helped me a lot to clarify analytical issues.
Okay.
Yeah, that is very important. So that is one of another problem or another issue in my generation at that time. It may not be the same for you, for your generation. When we started out as social scientists, we were always encouraged to do our PhD on our own country, which is what I did. Except that fortunately it was my country, but it was not so familiar to me. So I suppose I went through that challenge and that experience of trying to cross borders.
So it has become, I think, even more important at this moment.
And it's become even more important at this moment.
Because now that you've mentioned, it reminds us of all these issues of migration, which are still very big issues in Europe right now.
Very much so.
Yeah, so they have, and more often than not, I think the noise or the anger drowns out reason and also rationality to try to understand these issues, right? It makes it very important.
But the point I really think ought to be made is that reason and rationality, they're easy words to use. But I think I think what we need also are facts on the ground.
Facts on the ground, yeah.
And at the moment, I think social scientists have largely abrogated that responsibility and passed it on to journalists. So we don't really have.
We don't have, because you've
knowledge of the
ground. So the idea is we don't actually know what's actually happening.
We don't.
So we haven't even arrived at the stage of analysis yet, but we don't actually know what we have.
Yeah.
So that's a big problem.
That's what I see as a big problem. That's my pet peeve.
That's very. I think that's a very serious issue that we have not resolved. Yeah. So going on from there, in moving forward, or at least from now, what do you think are the big challenges or critical areas that we should really look at and try to have a more inclusive and critical discussion? Or what would you think are some of the...
Maybe let me add just a final statement to what we were just talking about. And that's why I think the social sciences are important.
Right.
The social sciences properly practiced is absolutely necessary to the project of tolerance, of nation building, not and of to the project of cosmopolitanism, of world building. But it must be a social. It's because it has to be understood as a set of ethical practices, of professional practices. I think that's very important, of professional practices, but also as a set of ethical practices. And in this combination, and only in this combination, not merely ethical practices, I think the professional practices are critical to the social sciences as well.
Okay.
It should not be seen as something that weak students do because they can't do any other to go into any other discipline. They go into social sciences.
It's like the arts and the science.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And it should be seen as a set of professional practices in conjunction with a set of ethical practices. Because I think the most professional, many social scientists do it for meaning in their own lives, and that's why why it has to be a set of ethical practices as well.
Yeah,
that's where the set of ethical practices. That's where the ethical imperative,
ethical commitment,
the ethical commitment, the ethical imperative comes from, and honesty, right? But the professional practices are critical as well. Because we claim after all that it should be a science. We know that. What science, right? Now after the recent pandemic, whose science?
Whose science?
But still, there must be a set of technical practices. I mean, when you do a recording, you have a set of knowledge of which have to be adhered to for the production of excellence.
Yeah.
And so I think that professional social science, the professional practice, as well as ethical practice, would define the social science or a social science that is of critical importance today. Still,
even more today, I think.
Even more today, to our country and to the world. Okay. Going forward, I think maybe that is perhaps the first thing that we have to make clear. That the social science is not something that only C class students go into.
Unfortunately, that's how the stereotype and
that's right. To break that stereotype, and we can only do it through our own practice. That's a challenge for the social sciences.
So, within the field,
especially in our country,
the profession, the field, and the profession itself. And I foresee with these challenges, economic especially coming up, I think it will face many more problems, I suppose, going forward in having financial allocations and attention. I think it would be even more contested and which unfortunately we have to grapple with and go through.
But the thing is, we don't really need much money to do good social science. That's what I found working in Malaysia. So if you're a foreign scholar, you need your airfare, you need make big project money. But think about working as a social scientist in Malaysia, doing serious research as a social scientist in Malaysia, is that you actually get the best of both worlds. On the one hand, you're in your home country, you're sitting in your garden, and then you go for an interview 1 hour later. You're not sweating it out in some godforsaken place in Kalimantan or something from which you cannot
get internet
escape,
connection.
Right? On the other hand, the diversity of life worlds in Malaysia means that you can expose yourself to that challenge of trying to understand the other
locally.
So and it doesn't cost very much. We really don't need very much money to do serious scholarship in Malaysia.
Right.
And maybe that's something that we should also make clear as a professional axiom in Malaysia. We don't need to go that route of applying for a grant. It costs a lot of time and effort.
It does.
Whether it is a government consultancy or international third-party grant or Rockefeller Foundation or Ford, it's always just for 2 years or 3 years. You're writing. You spend the first half year just getting a team together, and then you spend the last half year writing your report and making your. You may not have. We probably do not have to go that route to do serious scholarship and honest scholarship in this country.
So hopefully, I think the idea is to get maybe more awareness and maybe more active participation from people to at least get up and pay more attention to these issues and maybe to look at social science.
The idea is to get people excited about doing social science.
To be social science.
It's great. You learn about yourself. You learn about your country. And you don't even need very much money to do that.
It's just some curiosity, I think, and some need. And as you say, I think the idea, to have that view from below, I think that's a very important thing that maybe that even myself and we keep reminding ourselves. I think if this just to a bit wrap up and maybe to say, I think suddenly rings in my mind what you said. Your colleague or your professor reminded you as to who are the marginalized groups. I think we can all use that as a reminder and to know that social science is not only it's not only for personal understanding and also work as a employment, as a career, but it's also something which is more and bigger than that, which requires us. And I like world building that you use. Okay, so with that, I think thank you very much, Dr. Diana, for I think it was very interesting and productive, fruitful, and it's only that we don't have much time, but hopefully maybe we'll have another session later on. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Diana.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.